we'll thanks.
All righty. Well, welcome everybody. Let's jump in and get started. And thank you, Mariana, for that lovely introduction. Glad to be here today. So today we're going to be talking about Lau v. Nichols and Brown versus Board of Education. You should know that I will focus a lot of my energy on Lau v. Nichols within relationship to Brown. Policies at the local and the national level don't happen in a vacuum. They happen in relationship too. But I want us to really be thinking about language rights, particularly since in present times there has been great erosion and great efforts to ameliorate the efforts of bilingual and multilingual education. And that is why the book is called The Sunrise and Sunset of Bilingual Education. So this is from a book that, again, that Mariana mentioned. So there is a QR code there if you want to grab the link to the actual book. And I think that Amanda's going to put the hyperlink in the chat for us, should you be interested in doing that. And of course, please put in that discount code because we do that, right? So put in that coupon for a discount. So just as an overview of the book, it really follows the arc of Chinese and Chinese Americans in relationship to language rights, with a very central focus on Chinatown, San Francisco, a historic ethno-linguistic enclave that became as such because the Chinese were redlined to one part of San Francisco, unable to rent or own property outside of it. And basically, I begin with the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 and follow that through the civil rights movement, the development of the Lau case, the remedies in the Lau case, and then the movement towards more remedial remedies during the English-only movement. And then in our time of school choice and neoliberal policies and what that is doing to what bilingual education looks like on the ground. So my book is wrapped around a methodology that I call narrative policy portraiture, and I'm very interested in how policy was experienced and interpreted and narrated by the actual implementers. And here in a basement, we have Lucinda Lee, Kinikimon Lau's first teacher, who basically is talking to Chinese papers here in the basement. We're thinking that this is probably the mid-70s after Lau has passed, talking to Chinese parents about the benefits of bilingual education within a public school. They were largely receiving Chinese education after school from their local communities and churches. And Lucinda was saying there's an extension of this within the public sector. Interestingly, as we see the young Lucinda here, who is a very newly minted teacher, she's not in a school. She is in a church basement or a community center basement called the Cameron House in Chinatown, which presently is a youth organization for Chinese and Asian identifying youth within Chinatown proper. So I think it's important to think about language rights, that they don't just happen exclusively in schools. They happen in multiple social spaces, and ones that aren't necessarily led by typically named leaders. They are typically people that are drawn up from the grassroots. And Lucinda, who grew up without a bilingual education, is talking to families about some of the losses of her Cantonese and in what ways they could remediate that within schools. So my talk today, again, I'm going to principally focus on Lau, but I'm also going to do that nested within the Brown case, with Brown v. Board of Education basically saying that having a segregated education is not equal, and that similar resources, teachers should be availed to all students. And again, I'm going to focus on the Chinese Americans. But let's begin with Brown versus Board of the Education in Topeka, Kansas, 1954. And, you know, we often say Brown versus Board of Education. We've all read about it. We've all perhaps experienced its implementation in different parts of the country. But basically, it was Oliver Brown, who's a pastor, and his daughter Linda, who lived in a racially integrated neighborhood. And he wanted his children to attend the local elementary because it was nearby. But it was regarded as the white school. And so Oliver Oliver's children, Linda included, had to walk across town and basically travel distantly on foot through train stations, about 2 miles across Topeka, Kansas, to get to the all-black school. And so this is how the narrative begins. He found this to be problematic because it was traumatic to go that far. It was basically saying that if you live in proximity, it doesn't matter. There's a school only for you. And it obviously created a system of class exclusively based on the moniker of race. So as we know, in 1954 and again in 1955, with Brown versus Board of Education, there were different iterations of it over this 2-year period. We have Earl Warren giving the opinion of the court saying, we conclude that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place. Separate facilities are unequal. Therefore, we hold that the plaintiffs, the Browns, and others similarly situated for those the actions have been brought um, are basically a violation and deprive them of an equal protection of the laws guaranteed in the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment being the Equal Education Opportunity Act, as we know it. And so with this violation, the 14th Amendment is part of the Constitution. And so with all due force, integration based on race was to occur. However, if you look at this language herein, we don't necessarily see the naming of race per se, right? So I think that's an important thing to point out. But let's think about this. This is 1954. And 20 years later in San Francisco Unified at Gene Parker Elementary, which is right at the edge of Chinatown, a small school, Kini Kimoon Lau, a recent immigrant from southern China by way of Hong Kong, who spoke Cantonese, shows up at Gene Parker Elementary circa 1969, 1970. And he became the lead plaintiff. And what's very typical of the civil rights movement is there was the naming of children in court cases. A lot of times now we don't see that children are named because they're regarded as a vulnerable class. But back then we saw this as being very commonplace. So Kinney was at Gene Parker. He was just 8 years old, and again, a newcomer. And Alan Nichols was appointed to the school board for a vacant term by the supervisor of San Francisco. So thus we have the term, the case Lau v. Nichols, right? So basically, Kinney represented other plaintiffs, and Alan Nichols just happened to be the school board president, right? And when you become the school board president, if you're being sued, you become the de facto person who shows up on that lawsuit. But Lau says via the Supreme Court that schools receiving federal funds must provide English language instruction to non-English speaking students addressing the violations of the 14th Amendment and the Civil Rights Act. Okay. You'll find that in Lau, that was the effort, is that it was a violation of the 14th Amendment like it was in Brown, and a violation of the Civil Rights Act of 1964. We're going to learn later what that really ended up being in the end. But it started with families and the Chinatown Neighborhood Legal Assistance League and the Chinese for Affirmative Action in San Francisco's Chinatown. Mind you, you don't see schools in here. You don't see San Francisco Unified being a part of this effort of addressing the linguistic rights of the Chinese. So in the end, Lau did prevail. And what we come to know from the Supreme Court Justice William Douglas, there is no equality of treatment merely by providing students with the same facilities, textbooks, teachers, and curriculum. Remember what I just talked about with Brown, right? And equal education. But he goes on to say, for students who do not understand English are effectively foreclosed from any meaningful education. And one thing about the filing of the case in Lau is that it went through basically 3 stages before it ultimately went to the Supreme Court. And at every stage in the district federal courts, locally in California and within the region, it failed twice, basically saying San Francisco Unified is providing a fair education and an equal education because the children are in the schools. We're not denying them admission, they are there. But the case of Lau goes on to say they're effectively foreclosed from any meaningful education. So we regard this as language access, right? Which is really different than language rights, language access, that they have some sort of connection to the curriculum. So this is the difference between Brown and Lau. Brown was built on the premise of equal education and that everybody should receive the same treatment in terms of resources, facilities, teachers, etc. But Lau was different, and I love the way that Ed Steinman has described this. He talks about Brown as education outside the schoolhouse door. So simply, we look for schools to be racially integrated and for the schools to look similar in stature and quality. But then we see here with Lau v. Nichols is that it's educational access beyond the schoolhouse door and inside the classroom. How are kids getting access to the curriculum, to their instructors, if they are newcomers? And so what's different about Lau is what we know as the customization or the differentiation of treatment. And so those have long been the tensions behind how do we do racial equity and linguistic equity at the same time, right? When we think about the same treatment, right, that may have gotten us somewhere, but did we get to differentiation of treatment by a predominantly Black community throughout the US, right? Or did we just settle for same treatment? So, and realize these have happened, 20 years, there's 20 years time between them. So in my book, I draw on this, and I've also written about this in some other work, but this whole notion of negative liberty and positive liberty. And comes from Berlin's work, but Karen Thompson has more recently talked about it as negative equality versus positive equality. So this again is the tensions between Brown and Lau. All people are equal and therefore should be treated identically is the conception in the DSEG case of Brown. And Thompson refers to this as negative equality. So equality is there, but again, it is satisfied with at the schoolhouse door. And then Williams' second conception of equality, that all people are moral equals, but that the differential treatment is what equality demands, is the conception of the Lau v. Nichols case. And Thompson goes on to call this positive equality, and Edward Steinman, the lead lawyer, called it beyond the schoolhouse doors. So now I'm going to kind of go back in time, right? So I think it's important for you all to know that in my book, I flip to the present, flip to the back. And so I'm going to give you those cues when I'm doing so, because I promise it'll all come together in the end. So when we think about the Asian and Asian American diaspora and the long history in the United States, we can consider what happened with the Chinese on the building of the Transcontinental Railroad is the construct of subjugation. There were many racially minoritized groups and immigrants that came to build the Transcontinental Railroad, but the Chinese by far were the most subjugated. They received less wages, they worked longer hours, and they also had the worst conditions in which to work with. They were considered to be really good at their work, and there was absolutely racial cleavage, which is this tension between different immigrant groups of color, including Irish immigrants that were upset that they were able to work so quickly, and perhaps taking work away from them. So this idea of immigrants taking work from other groups has been this is a long history of this, right? So when we hear that presently, there is a historical basis to it. So, but we can see here the building of the Transcontinental Labor Railroad with the Chinese pictured here. But later, as we move on, particularly as we move into the 50s and the 60s, which is really at the height of Brown and at the height of the civil rights movement, we see this movement of the ascription of the Asian and Asian diaspora as being very valorized. We often hear the term model minority, which, by the way, was not created by Asian people. It was created by a white guy in 1968. So the notion of valorization that Asian groups have achieved relative English proficiency without support, without social resources. They have achieved relative success in profession and education. And so there's this notion of we've got it now. Everything's good. So this is a picture of my own family. My dad is the one up here, the one called Gene on top, right? That's Gene. That's my dad. And this is his dad and his 5 children. Um, and they all have relative success. They were all college educated, all wonderful professionals. They're all retired at this point or deceased. And Grandpa George there, I want you to notice what he's holding in his hand. He's holding a Bible, right? And so the Bible is a representation of conversion and change and as a form of assimilation. And so with those monikers of assimilation, there's a construction from the outside that suggests that Asian groups are more valorized and without resources, and therefore they just don't need as much. And so oftentimes we talk about this in language education and any type of equity work around race and language as the construct of erasure, right? So this is my matrix of racial and linguistic positioning that I draw from a bunch of different theories, including Langkrit, ratio-linguistic ideologies, and then also racial triangulation theory from Claire Jean Kim. And so Claire Jean Kim, this is sort of an adapted version of her work, looks at race always happens within relationships. And I have a friend that's actually really problematizing the black-white binary right now, finding that to be a problematic heuristic. But one thing that I think about, that I thought about as I was writing this book is how identities are imposed, how they're assumed, and how they're negotiated, and how there's 2 access points here. And we could put in a million other arrows here with different iterations, but I'm looking specifically in race and language. And so we tend to think about language as standardized or not standard. So an example of not standard, non-standard might be a kid who has an accent, which is so subjective, right? But is a really, really clear experience of many of the emergent bilingual youth in our schools. And then standardize, right? That it has a particular pristine condition and it sounds like mine, right? So, and then we see black and white and how there's a different positioning, right? And I put this in quadrants and you'll see why that is here momentarily. So again, I'm going to go back in time and I'm actually going to go back to around the time that the Chinese Exclusion Act is taking hold. And I'd like to introduce you to what San Francisco regards as one of the first Chinese American families in the United States. So, and this is a court case that was fought in the California Supreme Court called Tape versus Hurley. And I call this before Plessy, separate is equal, before Brown, separate is not equal, and before Lau, differentiation of treatment. There was Mary and Mamie Tape, and Mamie is right here in the middle. And like Kinney Lau was an 8-year-old who wanted to go to her nearby school, and her mom that advocated for her. So all 3 of these kids pictured here are the Tape children. They are all US born. The mother and father, Mary and Joseph, were born in China, but you'll learn a little bit more about them here shortly. So if you think that a child is US born, the thinking is they have a right to a free and public education. So, but what happened? Let me go back in time here. Mary took Mamie to the local Spring Valley Elementary, which is just adjacent to Chinatown, and it was their neighborhood school. And she wanted her daughter to go to school there. She was 8 years old. But Jenny Hurley, the principal, turned her away, saying, "We don't accept Mongolians. You are a suspect class. You do not belong in this space. So Mary Tate became very angry by that, and she took her case to the California Supreme Court, and she won, right? Basically saying Mongolians, Chinese, Asians have access to a free and public education. However, the San Francisco Unified Schools really didn't want to enroll her. And she continued, Mary continued to reattempt the enrollment of her daughter and continued to be turned away with such excuses as, we're full, you don't have your vaccinations updated, we don't have enough help for you in your grade level. But the backstory being is, we don't want you in here because you're Chinese, right? Mind you, this is as the Chinese Exclusion Act is starting to take hold. So what Mary does is she's a really early feminist and she takes to the papers and she writes something to San Francisco School Board and she posts it in basically this large circulating paper. And she says, will you please, dear sirs, will you please tell me, and this is in her real words, right? Is it a disgrace to be born a Chinese? Didn't God make us all? So do you see how she's invoking this narrative of valorization? We're Christian, right? And it's important to know that Mary was saved from a Chinatown brothel by a woman's group, and through that they educated her in English, converted her to Christianity, and that's why you see her attired in Victorian clothing. So she has done all of these things. She has learned English. She has become Victorian. She is married and she's a Christian. And so she's saying, why are you wanting to bar my children just because they're Chinese? Do you call that Christian? Do you see the invocation she has towards them? And then she goes on to say, my kids play with Caucasians ever since she could toddle around. If she's good enough to play with them, then why is she not why is she not good enough to be in the same room and do studies with them? So, and do you see here how she even uses the word justice, right? Um, there is not any right or justice for them. So, and again, this is in the 1800s. But Superintendent Mulder really was not okay with this, and they worked really, really hard to keep Mamie Tate out of school. And this is evidenced by some of the things that circulated in primary documents that are not really published in any place very easily findable. But this was a resolution and basically a memo that he sent to his principals. And he said, therefore, be it resolved that it is the sense of this board that no principals, teachers, or employee of the schools, department, or the city employ, patronize, or encourage the Chinese in any way, but do all in their power to legally promote their removal from this coast and discourage them from further immigration. And note the date, 1886, that is exactly when the Chinese Exclusion Act began. So even though they were there and their children were US citizens and they were considered adjudicated parents, it didn't matter, right? The ideologies were there. Another thing, so we see here the notion of subjugation with Superintendent Mulder. You don't belong here. But we go on to seeing Mamie, Joseph, and Mary, and the way in which a nearby article, a paper describes them. It basically says they were courted, they married. John built a neat little house in Western Addition, where in due time 2 little tapes appeared, Mamie and John. It was an American family in custom, costume, and speech. And the mission folk used to take visitors out to the tapes and exhibit them as examples of how Caucasian the Mongolian might be made. So we see here that we have this form of a valorization through Christianity and through religion. And so they really would parade people through their room to observe the possibility of converting groups of color. And mind you, this also informed what they ended up doing in their efforts to convert the Chinese in China. So what we see here is the valorization. The church and the missions and even Mary are basically saying, look at their class, look at their religion, look at their race, and that forms a form of whiteness, and see how they kind of get positioned on this lower quadrant that is more favorable. But we can see the notion of subjugation from Superintendent Mulder and the school board, imposing identities of foreignness based on language, race, and immigration status, of which neither of which was applicable, right? But you can see how they're placed here in this other quadrant. And so we see basically the sort of competing things of the churches with the schools. So if we look at Mamie and we look at Linda, right, even though they're separated by nearly 100 years, we have this notion of negative liberty. All people are equal and their should be treated identically is the conception of equality invoked in the racial Dicey case of Brown versus Board of Education, right? For Mamie, she never was able to go to Spring Valley Elementary. She attended a separate school called the Oriental School, which is at Commodore Stockton Elementary, modern day Gordon J. Lau Elementary, where bilingual education occurs today. So now I'm going to switch gears. We talked about Mamie from the 1800s. We talked about Linda Brown from the 50s, and now I'm going to move on to talking about the Immigration and Naturalization Act of 1965, which many, including myself, will describe our last significant immigration reform in the United States. It was signed by Lyndon B. Johnson, also someone who was very involved and signed off on the Civil Rights Act of 1964. He lifted immigration restrictions from Southern and Eastern Europe and Asia, also Latin America, and he prioritized family reunification and set a quota of 120,000 from the Western Hemisphere, which at the time was enormous. So, and you can see LBJ here signing this at Ellis Island amongst many probably familiar faces in there. So as a result of this, what ends up happening is that this is regarded as the conclusion of the Chinese Exclusion Act. And so you see this absolute flood. And also there is a lot of really difficult militaristic things happening in China. And so there is great movement into Hong Kong to escape China. And then many move from Hong Kong to the United States once the Immigration Act of 1965 is signed. So here we have Lucinda Lee Katz, who's Kenny Lau's first teacher, who she described, she says, I taught first grade in a storage closet. And one of her students was Kenny Kimon Lau, a recent arrival from Hong Kong and just 8 years old. And she says here, we found space wherever we could. And here's a picture. What's interesting here, do you see how the paper, it's not easy to see, but the paper really cropped out this image. So Lucinda thought that she was in a storage closet. But then when we found this archive at Berkeley in the archives, Lucinda is actually teaching in a teacher's workroom. And you can see here that she's teaching English and the children are on foldable chairs. And she said she would do this all day long with different groups of children. So, but this is her first encounter. I think it's super important to recognize Lucinda is a product of something called the Teacher Corps, which at the time was something that LBJ created around ensuring that teachers were either a linguistic or racial match to the students and their constituencies. And so the Teacher Corps, which was only lasted for 2 years in San Francisco Unified, basically went to schools, universities, and found liberal arts graduates and that were students of color and then placed them in their communities. So Lucinda, who was from Chinatown, was assigned to Chinatown's Gene Parker Elementary. Unfortunately, her master teacher, while she was student teaching under this program, was out sick and was not going to be back that semester. And Lucinda had to do parent-teacher conferences. So think of that. She's a student teacher and she meets Kenny Lau's mom. So she says, I was Kenny's teacher for 1 year at Gene Parker School, and his mother came in and said, Miss Lee, can you teach my son math and Chinese because I'm bilingual? And I said, actually, the language of instruction is English, so I cannot, but I can take him in after school and I can work with him and so forth. And Mrs. Lau said, no, it won't work that way because he's going to keep getting further and further behind. I want his class to be able to learn English and learn the other subjects in Chinese. And I said, well, that's not how the system is set up. right? So realize that Lucinda has not received a bilingual education other than a separate setting after school in her church community. And so for her, she is following what is the law and what was the law up until this point, that instruction could only be furnished in public spaces in English. So but this is the thing, Mrs. Lau was super persistent, and over time, she ended up taking Kinney and his other classmates after school and teaching them the other subjects, which introduced her to bilingual education being a possibility for what we call positive equality. So Lucinda had a boyfriend at the time and connected her with Ed Steinman, who is a civil rights lawyer working at the Chinatown Legal Assistance League. And Lau, the language rights case was hatched, and they found their primary plaintiff of Kinney Lau. Now, this is not a picture of Kinney Lau. This is Lucinda with one of her students, Melissa, who's one of the participants in the book. Kinney Lau was someone that I had hoped to find and interview, but there are many reasons that he doesn't want to have attention placed on him, and realize Kinney Lau never benefited from a bilingual education because court cases take so long to mitigate. And so by the time Lau had passed, he had moved on to middle school. So Ed, working at the Legal Assistance Clinic, works with Ling-Chi Wang of the Chinese for Affirmative Action, and together they recruited two sets of plaintiffs from Chinatown and throughout the city. The first set of plaintiffs, which included Kinney, were Chinese students with no language provisions. They weren't getting ESL. They were not getting any meaningful access at all, sink or swim. And the second set of plaintiffs is Chinese students not taught by a bilingual teacher. So I think it's important to note that Lau never prescribed a bilingual education. However, because of the social movement of the time, it became the model that was identified for reasons of affinity, kinship, and reclamation. So that is how the Chinatown community interpreted it, as did other ethno-linguistic communities, specifically Latinx. The class action suit was filed in the U.S. District Court in March of 1970, and just as Lau is brewing, SFUSD's version of Brown versus Board of the Education and their busing is beginning, right? So this is all kind of converging all at once. So Brown's version took on different iterations depending on what city you were in. So we have in San Francisco Unified, Johnson versus San Francisco Unified. And this is David Johnson and his daughter Patricia of Hunters Point, San Francisco. Hunters Point is located in this part of San Francisco, and 96% of the children that attended their schools there, they were predominantly Black. This was in proximity to a Navy Yard, and many of the African Americans were brought to this part of San Francisco from the South to work in the Navy Yards. Later, there would be a class action suit against the military for working in coordination with San Francisco State to ensure that Black students were not admitted to San Francisco State because the military needed them more. That also generated a lot of student movements at Berkeley and San Francisco State. Anyway, David was concerned that Patricia was not getting an adequate education relative to other schools. And so he is basically making the premise of it's unequal. And so I'm going to say we need stuff that's equal. And this is the original notion of negative liberty or negative equality. So busing begins in 1971. Mind you, Lau has not started yet. However, there is bilingual education going on across the way at Commodore Stockton Elementary. Busing begins, and you can see, for those of you that have worked in school districts, I'm sure you have seen a map that looks like this, which basically says what region are you in and where will you attend. But basically, at the beginning of busing, there were four specific races that were identified. Later, there was 7, and no school could have any more than 40% of one group over the other. So for instance, if you were in Zone 1, which is where Chinatown was located, in Chinatown, there had to be less than 40% of one given group in a school, right? With the hope that it really would become balanced over time. This is regarded as one of the most comprehensive busing systems in the United States. Most parts of the country identified race as Black and not Black. So an Asian student outside of San Francisco would be white. A Latinx kid out of San Francisco would be white, right? Denver versus Keys had white, Latino, and African American, but most other parts of the country in their version of Brown, it was mostly formulated across a Black-white binary, right? So that's what's going on in 1971. And then let's move forward to positive liberty. Positive liberty or positive equality says that lack of instructional access infringes on liberty. And this is the notion of freedom to or towards. It's increasing a child's autonomy and equality via the differentiation of treatment. And we see here that the Chinese students here are in their after-school program at the Chinese Benevolent Society, which is the governance structure of Chinatown. It still is. So just as busing is beginning, the Chinatown community is not happy. They do not want to be integrated. And we could argue that this is very racist. This is very anti-Black. But I want us to think about this a little bit differently because I think that's a really easy description and it doesn't help us think much, it doesn't help us think very deeply about that. But the reason they were fighting this is because they had learned to take care of themselves. They were redlined to Chinatown, told, don't cross Broadway Street. And so when you're told to take care of yourself, you take care of yourself. And they had built this huge infrastructure for Cantonese education in their community. And now they're saying their kids aren't going to be back in time for that after school program. So they didn't want their kids bussed away. They argued we want our own autonomy, we want our self-determination, and our preservation of our language rights, right? But the question is, were they thinking about racial and linguistic equity in terms of positive liberty, right? You can imagine the tension around this. So in response to busing, there was a boycott on busing, and the Chinese largely remained in Chinatown, not everyone, but a good chunk of them. And the Freedom Schools opened in fall of 71 with 14, almost 1,500 Chinese students representing 24% of San Francisco's former Chinese pupil. The schools have 4 core principles listed there. But again, the concern is this is a separate but equal situation, but it's being done in resistance to, right? And the Freedom Schools has nothing to do with African American freedom schools from the South. It had to do with ascribing themselves as being not being communist and being democratic citizens. So it was a political move. So this is the Namku Freedom Schools. This language school exists today. Kids still attend there after school and on Saturdays. And you can see that we have a white student sitting in the front row. And we can see here that they had anti-busing sentiments, but for reasons that were very, very different, right? But we can see here virtually and physically that this is sort of this proximity to whiteness, which we often talk about in Asian American ethnic studies. All right, let's think about when finally the Freedom Schools began to dissolve, only 2 years of it. So just as busing is happening, Lucinda Lee Katz she moves across the street from Jean Parker, where she had Kinney, to teaching in a Cantonese bilingual program made possible by the Bilingual Education Act of 1968. And they began their program in 1969 before Lau was implemented. And Lucinda is teaching in this program, and it's the same year that busing happens. And so you'll see this composite, this portrait. There are students that are African American, different Asian American kids, white kids, Latinx kids from the Mission District, and they all come together and they are all participating in a Cantonese bilingual education. So this is what I call a real snapshot in time where we have positive equality and negative equality happening together. Very, very short-lived. A few years later, we have Lau v. Nichols that passes and it prevails in the Supreme Court. And East West, which is the Chinatown weekly that is done bilingually, they call it a day of victory. So Ed Steinman at this point has moved on from his legal assistance gig and is now a Lau professor in Santa Clara. And he's listening to the radio and it says, 8 o'clock news, the US Supreme Court ruled unanimously, court to avoid the constitutional issue. This is super important. He then curses and says, oh, shoot. Because, of course, to legalize, you won over the Constitution. And that was the reason it was unanimous. It was not a constitutional decision. So even though Ed argued that it was a violation of the 14th Amendment as it was for Brown, he was not able to make that argument adequately for the Supreme Court. So Lau is only regarded as a violation of civil rights. And as we'll learn, that does not have the same strength because the violation of civil rights is not necessarily within, it isn't within the Constitution. So he goes on to say, if you made a decision based on statute or in law, it actually has federal regulations. Those regulations could be changed. And as we sit today, we know that there are movements to do so. One of the things that the Chinese began to do to promote children attending their racially integrated public schools and receiving a bilingual education was the work of the Association of Chinese Teachers, where they did positive and negative liberty together. This is from their bilingual weekly called East West. And we basically have this group of Chinese American teachers convincing families in the audience. And mind you, this is not a school. This is the Chinese Cultural Center. And so in this Chinese Cultural Center, they are basically demonstrating what it's like to have a bilingual education. The other thing that happened just on the seat of Lau going into the late 70s and early 80s is that there were massive teacher layoffs because of property tax freezes and different funding formulas. I'd imagine most of you sitting wherever state you're in, there is declining funding for public education. And when you have declining funding, as was the case here, there were massive layoffs. And so the notion within teachers unions is last fire, first hire, or what is it? Last hire, first fire. And if they were to do this, they would lose all of the Chinese teachers and African American and Latinx teachers that they brought in the 60s and 70s through the Teacher Corps, and they would have lost most of their teachers of color. So what happened is the Chinese community and the African American community worked in solidarity to avoid layoffs. And guess what happened? It worked. And if they had not done this at that time, the portrait of San Francisco Unified's teaching population would look very different. So this was a really, really great success. The Chinese for Affirmative Action, who helped launch the case, worked with Ed Steinman, and they became very much a part of the Bilingual Community Council, advising on what Cantonized bilingual education should look like in schools. And San Francisco Unified had a Lau consent decree in place from 1975 until 2019, when it was sunsetted because they argued that there was no longer an emergency for language or bilingual education. So that's a whole different story and different talk. We have someone like Lorene Chu, who basically went through and was a Title VII fellow, got her doctorate, and went on to train Chinese and Chinese American teachers to receive a BCLAD so that they could serve in San Francisco's Chinatown and beyond and furnish a Chinese education. The other thing that happened during this time is we have positive and negative liberty going on at the same time, right? Where we have similar resources, we have racial integration, we have language rights, language access that's availed to everybody. But there was lots of federal money coming into communities. And so we have something called the Emergency School Assistance Program, which gave money to reduce racial isolation. And so with that, we have the Chinese for Affirmative Action and also the Association of Chinese Teachers, who create this documentary with Lonnie Ding, a famous documentarian, called Bean Sprouts. And this particular program kind of was like the free to be you and me type thing. But the kids created the scripts, they ran the cameras, they created the plot lines, but it was all about what does integration look like across lines of race and language. And so there were, I think, 5 episodes of this, and it is a powerful indication of the solidarity that was going on racially and linguistically at the time. So I'm going to end with this. One of the things that we see here is what we call the trifecta of language rights from the 70s, affirmative action, and voting rights, right? So if we look at language rights and affirmative action, those are regarded as violations to the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and they have moderate legal strength. But voting rights, where you have the provision of bilingual ballots and the DMV having things in languages other than English, has greater strength because it's attached to the 14th Amendment and the equal protection of their educational rights. So one thing that I think is super important is that all of these people here, and these are the participants in my book, they participated in all 3 of these activities, right? Which meant that they were involved outside of their schools. They did much more in their community in terms of activism. So these are just some examples of the things that they did. And I'll end there. Thank you.